Hello, and welcome to a special COVID-19 episode of Checking the Vitals, a podcast powered by SpecialtyCare. In this episode, we talk to Gregg Agoston and Marcy Konja, two experts in the field of sterile processing. We discuss how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted sterile processing departments in hospitals around the country, and how some can start preparing for the influx of elective surgeries as the shelter-in-place orders begin to ease up. Enjoy the conversation. So, Gregg, Marcy, thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to talk to you guys about how the COVID epidemic is sort of impacting SPD or sterile processing departments around the country. So let's start with that. How has the COVID-19 epidemic sort of transformed or changed what's going on with sterile processing departments in hospitals around the country?
Well, in our hospitals, we're seeing two different episodes or however it's being played out. No two sterile processing departments are totally alike. They have different job duties. The main function is sterilizing and preparing instruments for the operating room, but they also may have other jobs. So our hospitals that have, during the slow time of surgeries, the hospitals that are supporting other areas with durable medical equipment like pumps, different machinery, and crash carts, code carts, intubation boxes. Those are the ones that are very busy right now covering COVID cases, helping with COVID cases, doing the reprocessing of the case carts, of the crash carts. Crash carts, intubation boxes, for the floors and for the patients. And I think other areas that are down because of the surgery volume, Gregg had some great ideas of how they could keep busy during this time.
Yeah. So let's actually sort of start off with sort of level setting so everyone sort of understands when we talk about SPD or the sterile processing department, what that is. So what is the role of the sterile processing department? Like, let's just say before COVID-19 had happened, what is the role that they played?
Sterile processing departments decontaminate, assemble, inspect, sterilize, and distribute instrument sets to the operating room and to floors in the hospital that use sterile sets or sterile supplies, labor and delivery, the ER, different areas like that. They can also have other functions where they're taking care of durable medical equipment, crash carts, intubation boxes, supplies. So they have a lot of different job functions that they take care of.
Sure. So obviously now a lot of that job function, or maybe just some of it, because they still have they're still providing a lot of valuable service to the hospitals even during this crisis. But so how has that shifted some from what I would call like a surgical related crisis to now a non-surgical related crisis like COVID-19?
So our hospitals that do the crash carts and the durable medical are where we had a hospital that did probably 5 crash carts a day in the past. They're doing anywhere from 35 to 55 a day because of intubation and taking care of the COVID patients.
Sure.
So we see that increase in that, and taking care of a code cart or a crash cart is very time consuming and very specific job duties and inspection that you have to do on that, and making sure that it's totally disinfected for the next case. So we see that increasing. We also see some hospitals are asking for reprocessing of PPE or the face mask, the N95 mask. None of our hospitals are doing it yet. But we have seen hospitals, we've been watching it, hospitals across the country are looking at doing it, from Nebraska to Michigan, New York.
Okay. Is there a process for cleaning a mask like that, an N95 mask?
So they're developing processes right now.
Okay.
It's kind of
early
there's
stages.
Been an emergency, Yes, there's been an emergency act put in place that the different sterilizer companies and companies that make the washers and the sterilizers are putting together protocols. They're very quickly putting them together, so they haven't fully been tested. they're not cleaned. The masks are not cleaned. They're decontaminated and disinfected through the process. They're not sterilized either, because there still may be something on them when they're being put into this process,
Okay.
and not cleaned, it can't be sterilized.
Sure. It sounds like that's still a work in progress as to how
Yes.
that's actually going to take place. So I'm sure the more that gets done, I guess the better the cleaning will be,
Mhm.
and maybe even sterilizing in the future. So it sounds like the sterile processing departments sounds like they're pretty busy. They might not be as busy as they once were because we're no longer doing elective surgeries in the country right now. So I'd imagine that shifted the department's staffing level. So the staffing level requirement gone up for SPD? Has it gone down with COVID-19?
We've seen it go down in the hospitals
Hmm.
that are not doing other job duties like the durable medical and the crash carts,
Okay.
because there's non-elective cases going. So hospitals that had 50 to 70 surgeries a day can possibly be doing 5 to 10 right now.
Oh, wow. So, and I should put it in perspective. I mean, just because New York and some other select cities have a lot of COVID patients, there are a lot of hospitals that don't. And a lot of those hospitals are not really doing elective surgeries unless there's an emergency need for an elective surgery or something like that. So that does actually make quite a bit of sense. Now, you mentioned early on that Gregg had some thoughts on what SPD departments could do during this time where their staffing needs aren't as high, but so they could still stay busy. So, Gregg, what are some of those?
The SPD departments, because there is this gap for many of them, because again the number of patients has luckily and thank God the number of patients has not been as high as it was projected.
Sure.
They do have some excess capacity and some excess time. So
Mhm.
there's lots of things within sterile processing that really could be focused on to help improve current processes and then for future growth, such as reorganization of sterile storage. So a lot of sterile processing departments also are responsible for the sterile storage of the instruments as well as the disposable products. We visit many hospitals that really could benefit by reorganization to make those processes more efficient. And for instance, in cases, we've gone to some hospitals where they've got storage separated in multiple different areas. So they could have instruments down in the sterile storage area. They could have instruments stored up in the operating room,
Right.
in other locations. And when you have that type of situation, it makes it very, very difficult for staff members to locate and find and efficiently gather the equipment needed for the surgery. So one simple example where reorganization, it's actually a big project, but if there's time that something could be done, would maybe that would be a focus. Education and training for staff is always critical.
Absolutely.
Reaching certification levels for training for that. So again, time could be dedicated to training. Time could be dedicated to cleaning, the department, and just reorganization, making sure that everything is set up. Time could be dedicated to planning for future events. And we talk about this as being a disease-related event, not so much focused on sterile processing. But if this was an event that required surgery by a lot of patients, some calamity happened where all of a sudden the hospital is flooded with surgical patients, sterile processing would really be 100% involved and would really need to step up.
Absolutely.
So planning for a future event like that, I think is good. So
And
there's a lot
Gregg,
of things that you can do.
absolutely.
Yes.
And to that end, because we're not doing elective surgeries right now, I would imagine, and I'm by no means a hospital administrator, but I would imagine there are a lot of elective surgeries that are piling up in the queue. Obviously, we
Absolutely.
don't know when we're going to be able to do those again or when hospitals will be able to do those again. But I'd imagine that when that happens, there will be quite a rush on those surgeries. And
Oh
thus,
yeah.
SPD departments will
Absolutely.
be much,
Yeah.
much busier. So, what would you suggest as we come out of this crisis, which it seems like we will over the course of the next few weeks? What would you suggest they do to ramp up for what I will imagine will be a very, very busy next 3-4 months?
Yeah, I mean, so that it's a great point, Todd. I think making sure that they've got so Marcy did a very good job of explaining kind of the role and function of
Absolutely.
sterile processing. If you boil it down, it's basically having instruments and equipment ready, functional, and safe to use. So
Right.
those are the three parameters. So they really need to look at their inventories. It's a good time to go back and adjust to make sure that they've got the right equipment in the right instruments in the right sets. Looking at preference cards, because there's a lot of waste that happens in sterile processing departments. Again, where instrument sets may go up to the OR, and just over time the set has expanded. They've added more instruments. Doctors have said, I need this instrument, that instrument, and over time these sets become larger and larger. It's a good time to look at that and see, do we really have the right instruments and the right sets? Because if you send a bunch of instruments up to the operating room that are not used on a regular basis, that just is extra work for everybody. It's extra repair, it's extra expense, and it slows the system. So, when we get into a situation where there's high demand for surgery again, you want to make sure that department is functioning as efficiently as possible. So that's the key thing, I think, is looking at how can we make this department more efficient in the future, and what can be done now to prepare for a future crisis that could be more surgical related than it is now. The other thing that this crisis with the epidemic is bringing to focus is the extreme importance of the cleaning and disinfection. We know from everything that's been said, this all starts with like your hand washing and making sure that we're practicing good hand washing procedures.
Right.
That's been drilled into everybody across the country for many, many years. But yet we still see. Sounds a little gross, but I can't tell you how many times I'm in the men's room and you see people walk in and walk out without ever washing their hands.
That blows my mind. Even now, yeah, that blows my mind.
Yeah, just read this morning a piece in Becker's. Unfortunately, hospital-acquired infections. In 2018, the last report, over 680,000 of those infections. Still, 72,000 people died in that year. That's a 10% death rate from hospital-acquired infections. Big issue related to cleaning keyboards and cell phones and things like that. And they've done tests and studies to see, that there's actually pathogens that live. Actually, the one study they did, there was 4 times as many pathogens on a keyboard as there were on the toilet seats that they tested in the hospital.
Oh.
So. And you think about it, you're touching them all the time. People go into the staff goes into the patient's room and touches the keyboards even after they disinfected their hands. So they can be picking those microbes up and transmitting them. So I think this COVID-19 virus is going to bring more importance to cleanliness and also to processes and procedures, which I think is very good because, again, going back to sterile processing with Marcy and I have seen in many hospitals that oftentimes instruments, number one function is to clean the instrument because you can't sterilize it if it's not clean.
Right.
But yet we see often examples across the country where instruments that have not been properly cleaned, either because they weren't disassembled properly or the technician didn't pay attention or didn't perform a process or procedure, but those instruments still end up showing up in instrument sets and potentially up in the operating room. So it's going to grow. It should draw greater focus and importance to that, which is a good thing for all of us.
One of the things that I think is the most scary about COVID-19 is the fact that it can stay on surfaces for a very, very long time. And if you're not disinfecting things correctly because your SPD department isn't functioning correctly, or they just aren't properly trained on how to disassemble these items because they're very intricate. They're very, maybe not every one, but there are a lot of disinfecting needs that are very specialized and hard to do. So if you're not getting in there and cleaning them, the virus that COVID-19 is will last for, forgive me, I don't know the exact numbers, but days. It's a long time that it can stay outside the body, which is one of the reasons it's so infectious.
Yeah. Well, same as with hepatitis. So I think the hepatitis can remain viable on hard surfaces for I think up to a week.
Oh,
and
wow. Okay.
so it's a virus and it can still be transmitted. COVID-19 apparently, from what we've heard, can last longer, which makes it more virulent. And
depending on the surface type, we're hearing different things between cardboard, between stainless steel, between wood, different items or different materials. It can last longer, possibly.
Right. Yeah. So it really just drives home the importance again of good use of personal protective equipment.
Yeah.
Every sterile processing staff member, when they touch something, They need to be thinking of it as it's contaminated. Something that I've been pushing, is that hand washed items. We see a lot of items that are delicate that get hand washed only in sterile processing and not, quote, disinfected. So hand washing can remove organisms by the use of enzymatic, but it's not designed to kill the organisms. So typically, like a stainless steel instrument will go through a washer disinfector that will wash with enzymatic, will thoroughly rinse, and then go through a heat cycle. It'll take the temperature up to about 193 degrees to kill organisms so that it's safe to handle with bare hands when it comes out the other side. There's another set of instrumentation that goes through sterile processing, like cameras, shavers, some rigid endoscopes, things like that, flexible endoscopes that actually are only hand washed with enzymatic and may or may not be disinfected by the hospital and their pass through. Those instruments technically still should be considered contaminated in the sense that they weren't disinfected. And so extra precautions, I believe, need to be taken when you handle those. It would be like, again, somebody who has COVID-19 sneezing on a piece of paper and then handing the paper to you. Those organisms could still be on there. You could still transmit them to yourself, even though you don't see them. Viruses are, thousands of times smaller than a bacteria. You can't see it with even with the highest power standard microscope. You have to use an electron microscope to see them. But yet they're still there and still can transmit disease. So I think it's going to bring a greater awareness to the need for greater care and handling of the instruments.
So
and safety.
I completely agree. Yeah. And it's sort of one of the things that I think has been most interesting to me about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it's sort of showcasing a lot of things that maybe always needed to be fixed. Everything from, things that you're talking about here with the sterile processing department, but also to how we view healthcare workers, I think has changed. But the healthcare workers have always worked the way they work, So we're just now, I think, appreciating it as much as we always should have. So it's very interesting to me. But let me ask, what are the current issues in sterile processing that could have a negative impact on their ability to meet a hospital's needs in a time of crisis like this?
Well, staffing. In reviewing hospitals and providing assessments to hospitals across the country, it's very rare to find a hospital that is staffed correctly in their sterile processing department. It's one of the areas that when the OR grows and adds on cases and adds on OR rooms and new surgeons, we buy new instrument sets, we staff the OR, and very rarely do they remember that we may need a couple more sterile processing technicians in sterile processing to handle all the instrument sets. So that is something that is a problem right now for hospitals that are busy and their sterile processing is getting the hit of helping out, especially with an increased volume in their other areas besides the instrument sets. If they're not staffed properly, according to how many procedures they're doing or how many instrument sets are going through, that can be hitting them right now, or they won't be prepared because they haven't had the time to do the other things that Gregg has talked about, where the inventory isn't correct, the preference cards aren't updated, the place isn't cleaned properly because you don't have time. Those are some of the things that are issues when it's so busy. And now is the time to be focusing on that. One other thing that I did want to mention was maintenance of the equipment.
Right.
It was the time to follow up on maintenance and cleaning of the sterilizers, doing preventive maintenance on the sterilizers while they're not running so much, and the washers and any equipment in the department.
Yeah. So I just might add on, as far as, again, some things that could be done is preference card updates, instrument set review and update, making sure they've got the right amounts. Locations, their storage is another area that is important. We talked about before. So there's lots of things that could be done on sterile processing right now. Back to your original question, Todd, about like what are the needs. One of the things we see in hospitals Marcy and I have experienced this, and the reality is that sterile processing being created many years ago when we had primarily just stainless steel instruments. And then we've had this revolution in new surgical procedures that brought in these complex instruments, robotics and flexible scopes and cameras and video equipment, et cetera. These, all the advanced orthopedic procedures we're doing today, it requires more complex instruments. And one of the challenges for many SPDs, particularly where you have is just specialization and the retaining the employees. So, and specialization I'm talking about is having people who are competent with handling all of that equipment and can process it. And then you run into this issue. You got some smaller hospitals that may only have 5 or 10 people working in their sterile processing, and just by design they have to handle basically every instrument in the hospital because you don't have enough staff to be able to say, okay, you're specialized to process these instruments and you specialize to process these instruments, and everybody's trained. So the goal is to get everybody trained up. The challenge is that with sterile processing, again, one of the things that hopefully will come out of this is for the executive leadership of the hospitals to recognize the importance of sterile processing in the staff and to invest in that staff, because we see hospitals that have turnover of 20% or more a year. We see hospitals that have half of their staff being travelers or agency people. And so this constant influx and outflux of people where you can never get somebody fully trained in all the equipment means that for all those procedures that are being done, you've got people who probably are not fully capable of performing all the processes that need to be done. And by those processes, Marcy said earlier, it's the receiving the item, it's the recognizing what the item is, it's the disassembling the item, the proper cleaning with the proper solutions, the proper processes and procedures, the proper inspection of the item, the reassembly of the item, the sterilization of the item. So what you find out is that if you have somebody who's only been there for 4 or 5 months, they may know how to get something and just wash it, but they don't know all the intricacies. It's different areas or channels need to be brushed or flushed or whatever may be done. And so those things get skipped. And then we end up with either damage to equipment or equipment that's not processed properly. And that equipment shows up in the operating room. So that's a real challenge for sterile processing. And it's related to the pay. Typically, sterile processing departments are not paying the wages that are competitive to keep highly engaged, highly motivated staff there in many cases. So pay needs to be adjusted, recognition for the work they do. And then in cases where you have a large enough department where you've got staff that could become specialized, where you could say, okay, this group is going to be trained specially for orthopedics or minimally invasive instruments. So those two areas put together probably account for at least 50% of the surgical procedures, if not more, in the hospital. So having specialists handle the complex equipment will help get better results. And those are some of the things that we see are major issues. And again, hopefully that can be addressed through this crisis, because again, the importance of sterile processing, even though this is a disease-related crisis and not a surgical-related crisis, there may be a surgical-related crisis just around the corner. We just don't know. And we need to be prepared for it.
Well, I think there might be as we come out of this. Maybe not a crisis, but a lot of people will be going in for those elective surgeries. So it may not be a crisis per se, but people will be very, very busy. And that may cause a crisis of staffing or those kind of issues, right? One thing I did want to ask before we close up is the CDC has said as we start to move back into work and maybe daily, infection rates drop a little bit, but we'll still see spikes in certain areas probably for a year or two until we get a vaccine to sort of knock this thing out. So what would you suggest to SPD directors or hospital administrators or even executives at hospitals? What would you suggest that they do to prepare their SPD or surgical processing departments for those future eventualities?
Yeah, I think it's really just what you said is they really need to sit down with the leadership of sterile processing and the executive leadership of the hospital and really focus and look at the numbers of, what is the current reality at that hospital? Are they fully staffed? Does everyone certified and been checked out with competencies, that they understand that they can process all of the instrumentation? Do they have a lot of agency people in there because they get a revolving door? They can't keep staff.
Right.
I mean, if you've got situations like that, then you jeopardize the meeting or jeopardize the hospital. So doing that, I think is just reinforcing the need and importance of an effective and highly functional, highly productive sterile processing department in the hospital. That's my conclusion on that. It really is a good opportunity to come back and look at. The reality is that hospitals are going to be reeling after this event, and most likely we're not going to want to take the time to do that because they're going to have other priorities. But I think it's something that should be listed on that priority list as high as they possibly can get it, because it's if it doesn't happen tomorrow, it's going to happen sometime in the future, and it certainly affects patients.
Yeah.
Just a quick note, I read that in 2018 from the CDC, there's 682,000 people with healthcare acquired infections in the hospital. 73,000 of those people died. That's a 10% death rate.
Yeah.
So we're talking right now, COVID of, right now it's showing, if you just look at the numbers today, it was 4%, but the reality is it's probably a lot less than that, because there's probably a lot of people that have had the disease that were never tested.
Yeah. Just never knew. Yeah.
We've shut the country down for a 4% death rate, from COVID right now. We've got a 10% death rate that we've got from hospital acquired infections.
Yeah.
So it's important that everybody focus on that and continue. Obviously COVID is, has other ramifications and other things. I'm not downplaying the severity of it or the importance of the people that are working in the hospitals and treating those patients, because hats off to them, because they're doing a fantastic job. But it's just the fact that there's other areas too that need to be addressed. And that's why I'm saying that SPD importance needs to be up there in the ranking somewhere.
Absolutely.
I totally agree. And now is the time to be working on properly training and performing competencies. It's a great time to do that. I know this is April. We're in April, right? April, May is usually the time for ISHM renewals. So there's a lot of people out there that need CEUs. So a lot of training that can be done for sterile processing employees and staff.
Yeah, and really just gearing up for when we can return to normalcy, and then that influx of surgeries that will be happening during that time, because we haven't been able to do them for a month and a half at this point.
So there's going to be a lot coming at one time.
Yeah, there's a huge backlog right now of people who need surgeries that are considered elective, right? So that's my biggest concern coming out of this is, will SPDs be prepared for that time, that influx? And if SPD's departments are not busy right now, say you're not in New York and you don't have an influx of COVID patients you're having to prepare code cards for, things like that, now's the perfect time to get ready to ramp up for that. I mean, we know it's going to happen. It's not like COVID. We're not unsure if it's going to hit a certain area. We know it's going to hit, because we know there's a 4 to 6 week backlog of surgeries. So right now is the time to prepare for that. So Gregg, Marcy, thank you so much for taking the time to sort of have this conversation with me about this. I learned a lot. I hope the listeners learned a lot as well. And I really do hope a lot of hospital administrators sort of take heed that one of the most overlooked departments, at least I feel like it is, should be really looked at and really worked on right now, because they're going to have an influx of cases very soon.
Yeah.
So thanks for taking the time, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.